My name is Magnus Vale. I am 37 years old, a husband, or at least I used to be. Marriage is about building something strong, or so I once believed. A foundation made of trust, of memories, of quiet mornings and whispered confessions at midnight. But foundations crumble. And love? Love is not unbreakable. Now, I sit in an empty house, drowning in silence. A half-empty glass of whiskey rests in my hand, the ice melting, the liquor watered down. I haven't taken a sip in minutes. I don't know what I'm waiting for. I just know that my wife walked out the door tonight, and she never looked back. It started subtly, the kind of shift you don't notice at first. At least not until it's too late. Missed dinners, unanswered texts, a lingering scent of someone else's perfume on her skin. The way she would stand by the window late at night, scrolling through her phone, her back turned to me, always turned away. I remember the exact moment I knew something had changed. It wasn't the way she avoided my touch, or how she suddenly started working late. It was the way she said my name. Once, when she spoke, my name was warmth, a gentle whisper at the end of a long day. Now it was just a word, no tenderness, no familiarity, just a syllable she had grown tired of. Magnus. Not darling, not love, just Magnus. Then there was him, Dorian K.L. The name left a bitter taste in my mouth. I had seen the way she looked at him, heard the way she laughed too easily at his jokes. I wasn't a jealous man, at least I didn't used to be. But even a fool could see what was happening. And tonight she didn't even bother hiding it. Celine stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her earrings. She wore a black dress, elegant, form-fitting, effortlessly seductive. The fabric clung to her curves like a second skin, accentuating every line of her body. I watched her through the reflection, and for the first time in years, I realized she wasn't dressing for me. She wasn't mine anymore. She had already left me. She was just waiting for the right moment to walk away. The room smelled of jasmine and amber, her perfume, familiar, yet distant, like a memory I was already starting to forget. "You look beautiful tonight," I said. She smiled, but it was wrong. Polite, rehearsed, the kind of smile you give a stranger in passing. "Thank you." I wanted to say more. I wanted to ask, "Do you still love me? Do you still think about the life we built together? Do you feel anything at all?" But I already knew the answer. She reached for her clutch, glancing at her phone. "Dorian is picking me up." I clenched my jaw. Of course he is. "Are you sure?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Celine finally looked at me, her gaze unreadable. "Yes. He has a car. It's more convenient." He. The way she said it, so casual, so effortless, made my stomach twist. For a moment, I thought about stopping her, telling her not to go, demanding answers. But then reality sank in. If I had to stop her, then I had already lost her. "Don't stay out too late," I said instead. She didn't even hesitate. "Go to bed, Magnus." And then, she walked to the door. I waited for something. A pause. A look back. A second of hesitation. Something to tell me she still cared. But she never turned around. The door clicked shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. The whiskey burned as it slid down my throat. Outside, the world was silent. Inside, the house felt colder than it ever had before. The ticking of the clock filled the empty room, marking the slow, suffocating passage of time. I had once believed in Celine. I had once believed in us. But now? Now I wasn't sure if the woman I married had ever really existed. 1:47 a.m. She wasn't home. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. A slow unease curled in my chest. Celine never turned off her phone when she was out. Unless she didn't want to be found. I hesitated. Then, I dialed her number. Ring, ring, ring. No answer. I called again. The phone was off. That made me sit up. Celine was reckless, but she was never careless. A dozen explanations ran through my mind. Maybe the battery had died. Maybe she was somewhere loud and didn't hear it. Or maybe she was already gone. I poured myself another drink, but the alcohol did nothing to quiet the storm inside me. I stared at the wedding photo on the shelf. The two people in that picture? They were ghosts. The man in that photo believed in love, believed in loyalty, believed in her. I wanted to be angry, wanted to break something. But I did nothing. I just sat there, drinking, waiting for something I couldn't define. Waiting. Without knowing I was waiting for the worst nightmare of my life. 2:15 a.m. The house was too quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that lingers after a long day, where the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards keep you company. No, this was a different kind of silence. A silence that watched. A silence that waited. I had been staring at my phone for the past half hour, my thumb hovering over Celine's name in my call log. Once. No answer. Twice. Phone off. That shouldn't have meant anything, but deep down, I knew it did. Celine never turned off her phone, not when she was out, not when she was drinking, not even when we fought. Unless she didn't want to be found. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe she's still at the party. Maybe she's ignoring me. But another thought slithered into my mind, wrapping around my chest like a vice. What if she's not answering because she can't? I pushed the thought away. I got up from the couch, restless, pacing the dimly lit living room. The weight of the night pressed against my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my phone again, scrolling to our last conversation. Celine, I'll be out for a while. Don't wait up. Me, okay. Let me know when you're on your way back. She had seen it. She just never replied. I swallowed hard. That wasn't like her. Celine might have been distant, cold, deceptive, but she wasn't reckless. I scrolled further, reading through old texts, old pictures, our past frozen in digital moments. The weekend trips, the morning coffees, the nights we spent tangled in each other's warmth. I barely recognized us anymore. A slow, uneasy dread spread through my veins. Then, my phone buzzed. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. I jolted, my breath caught in my throat as I looked down at the screen. Unknown caller. A cold prickle ran down my spine. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I answered. Magnus Vale? A man's voice, low, controlled, not Celine. My stomach twisted. Who is this? A pause. Then, I need to talk to you about your wife. The words hit me like a fist to the gut. A sharp, cold panic sliced through me. Where is she? Silence. Heavy, measured. Then, meet me at Haven Diner, 3 a.m. I'll explain everything. The line went dead. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Haven Diner. A rundown, late-night spot on the edge of town. Why the hell would someone want to meet me there? I turned the phone over in my hands, replaying the conversation. The man hadn't sounded rushed. He hadn't sounded concerned. And that terrified me. I grabbed my jacket and keys, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop, to think, to consider what I was walking into. But none of that mattered. I had to find out what happened to Celine. The drive felt longer than it should have. The city lights faded in my rearview mirror as I passed empty streets, my tires humming against the asphalt. The further I drove, the quieter everything became, like I was leaving behind the real world and entering somewhere else entirely. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I wasn't sure if I was breathing. Haven Diner sat at the far end of the lot, its neon sign flickering in and out, casting blood-red shadows over the cracked pavement. The place looked empty, except for one car, a dark sedan parked near the back. Its windows were tinted, impossible to see through. I swallowed hard. For a brief moment, I considered leaving. I could turn the car around, drive home, pretend none of this ever happened. But then what? Go back to my empty house? Sit in the dark, staring at my phone, waiting for a message that would never come? No. I needed answers. I stepped out of the car, scanning the lot, my pulse pounding in my throat. The air smelled of stale grease and gasoline. Then, a figure emerged from the sedan. Tall, lean, dressed in dark clothes. He moved toward me with slow, measured steps, like someone who never rushed. As he got closer, I saw his face. Sharp features, cold, observant eyes, and something in his expression told me he wasn't just here to talk. Magnus Vale? I nodded slowly. Who the hell are you? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open just enough for me to see the credentials. Private Investigator, Kieran Holt. I've been looking into Dorian Kale, he said, and I think you're going to want to hear what I found. My stomach turned to ice. Dorian. This wasn't just about Celine. It was about him, too. I exhaled, trying to steady myself. All right, talk. Kieran cast a glance around the empty lot, then nodded toward the diner's entrance. Not here. Inside. I hesitated. Something about this didn't feel right. The way he was watching me. The way he had called me first instead of going to the police. I should have asked more questions, should have demanded more answers before stepping inside. But I didn't. I followed him into the diner, and without knowing it, I walked straight into the beginning of my nightmare. The moment I stepped into the diner, I knew something was wrong. The air inside was thick, heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and old grease. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering erratically. The place was almost empty. A tired-looking waitress stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. An old man sat hunched over a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. And yet, I felt watched. Kieran led me toward a booth in the farthest corner, away from the windows. His movements were slow, deliberate. I followed, my pulse hammering against my ribs, every muscle in my body wired tight. The only sounds were the faint hum of electricity and a slow, rhythmic drip. Somewhere, a leaky faucet. Kieran slid into the booth across from me. The vinyl seat cracked beneath his weight. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just studied me, his gaze cool and calculating, like he was measuring something unseen. Then, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black notebook. He flipped through the pages, the paper rustling against the silence, before finally looking up. I need you to listen carefully, Magnus. What I'm about to tell you, it won't be easy to hear. My hands curled into fists beneath the table. Just say it. Kieran hesitated for half a second, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat and slid something across the table. A photograph. The second my eyes landed on it, something cold and jagged twisted in my stomach. Even through the grainy, low-quality image, I recognized her instantly. Celine. She was standing in a dimly lit hallway, her back partially turned to the camera. She was still wearing the black dress, the same one she had left the house in. But something was wrong. Her posture was stiff, tense, and behind her, I felt my breath hitch. Behind her was a door, slightly ajar, and a dark figure standing just beyond it. Not Dorian, not anyone I recognized, but there was something about the way the figure stood, unnaturally still, just barely within the frame, like they had been caught watching her. A slow chill crawled down my spine. I looked up at Kieran. Where was this taken? His expression darkened. A rental house on the outskirts of town, the same place Dorian took her that night. I swallowed, my pulse roaring in my ears. And? Kieran exhaled, then pulled out another photograph. This one was worse. A room. Concrete walls, dim, yellowish lighting, and blood. So much blood. It streaked across the floor, splattered against the walls in violent arcs. A crimson stain soaked into the concrete, dried at the edges. And in the middle of the mess, a single abandoned high heel, the same one Celine had been wearing. A sick, twisting sensation coiled in my gut. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to look at the picture, to absorb the details, even as my mind screamed to turn away. My voice was hoarse when I finally spoke. Tell me everything. Kieran leaned forward, lowering his voice. That house wasn't just a place for a party. It was a hunting ground. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. A hunting ground for what? Kieran's jaw tightened. People like Dorian. People who don't just cheat, Magnus. They lure, they take, and sometimes... He glanced at the bloody photograph. They don't leave anything behind. My skin crawled. No, that doesn't make sense. Celine wouldn't... But I stopped myself. Because I didn't know what Celine would or wouldn't do anymore. Because I had let her walk out that door without looking back. And now, she was just... gone. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. You think Dorian set her up? That she was his victim? Kieran exhaled. I don't know. What I do know is that Dorian is missing too. And that house? It wasn't just abandoned. It was cleaned. Something in the way he said it sent a fresh surge of unease through me. Cleaned? Kieran nodded. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. No bodies, no fingerprints, nothing left behind except for what you see in those pictures. But there was something else. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a small plastic bag. I frowned. What is that? He slid it across the table. I hesitated, then picked it up. Inside the bag was a single playing card. The Queen of Hearts. But the Queen's face had been cut out, leaving a hollow, empty space where her eyes should be. A slow, suffocating dread spread through my chest. Something about it felt wrong. Like a message. Like a warning. Kieran watched me carefully. That was left at the scene. Just that. Nothing else. I set the bag down slowly, trying to keep my hands from shaking. What the hell does it mean? Kieran leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. That's what I'm trying to figure out. But I'll tell you this much. It's not random. This means something to them. And if they left it behind... He paused. They wanted you to see it. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I clenched my fists, my nails biting into my palms. Who the hell are we dealing with, Kieran? His expression darkened. I don't know. But whatever this is, it's bigger than just your wife. The words hung between us, thick with something I couldn't name. I looked down at the photograph again. At the blood, the shoe, the playing card with its hollowed-out face. Celine was gone, and I had no idea if I would ever see her again. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stop until I found out the truth. Even if it killed me. I didn't remember leaving the diner. One moment, I was staring at the blood-stained photograph and the hollowed-out Queen of Hearts. The next, I was outside, the cold air slicing through me like a blade, my breath unsteady, my thoughts tangled in knots. Everything felt surreal. Celine wasn't just missing, she had been dragged into something far darker than an affair. And now, I wasn't sure if she had been a target or a pawn. I leaned against my car, gripping the door handle so tightly that my knuckles ached. My mind replayed the images over and over, her standing in that hallway, unaware of the shadow behind her. The blood, the playing card, the shoe. None of it made sense, until Kieran said it. "You're not going home tonight." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Something firm, something final. I turned to him, my heartbeat still pounding in my ears. "Why?" Kieran sighed, glancing around the nearly empty parking lot. The streetlights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. "Because they want you to know, Magnus. They're watching." A chill rippled down my spine. I swallowed. "Watching me?" Kieran didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his gaze scanning the street, the parked cars, the shadows stretching beyond the reach of the neon diner lights. Then, he turned back to me. "I think they've been watching you for a while." Something sharp and ugly twisted in my gut. I thought back, tried to piece together the last few months, searching for signs I had missed. Had there been someone lingering too long near my house? A car parked down the street for no reason? Or was I just losing my mind? I let out a shaky breath, rubbing my hands over my face. "So what the hell do we do?" Kieran pulled his keys from his pocket. "We move. Now." I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming not to get into a car with a man I had met less than an hour ago. But what other choice did I have? Celine was gone. Someone had left that card for me, not just as a warning, but an invitation. And I needed to know why. So I got in my car and followed Kieran into the dark. The safe house wasn't what I expected. I had pictured some rundown motel or a forgotten storage unit on the outskirts of town. Instead, Kieran led me to an abandoned warehouse, buried deep in an industrial district that looked long deserted. The kind of place where people disappeared, and no one asked questions. The inside was sparse, just a desk cluttered with papers, an old couch, a makeshift kitchen in the corner. It was clear that no one really lived here. Kieran locked the door behind us and threw his keys onto the counter. "You should get some rest." I let out a bitter laugh. "Sure, I'll just sleep like a baby after finding out my wife is either dead or—" I stopped myself, because I didn't want to say the rest of that sentence out loud. Kieran didn't argue. Instead, he walked over to the desk, shuffling through a stack of files until he found what he was looking for. "Come here." I moved toward the desk, my pulse quickening as he spread out a few documents in front of me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then, my stomach dropped. They were photographs, not just of Celine, of me. I inhaled sharply. "What the hell is this?" Kieran tapped one of the images. "These were taken over the past few weeks. Outside your house, your office, the grocery store." My skin prickled. I flipped through them, my hands shaking slightly. Me, leaving work. Me, unlocking my front door. Me, standing at a crosswalk, completely unaware that someone was watching. I felt like the ground beneath me was splitting open. "You're telling me someone has been following me? For how long?" Kieran exhaled. "Before Celine disappeared." My entire body went still. Before the affair, before the night she went missing, before any of this started. I stared at him, my mouth dry. "This isn't just about her, is it?" Kieran didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another photograph. I almost didn't want to look. But I did, and I felt my breath hitch. The image was grainy, but unmistakable. A figure, standing near a parked car, half hidden by shadows. Their face was turned away from the camera. but in their hand, a playing card. I grabbed the picture, bringing it closer. Even in the low quality, the design was clear. Another Queen of Hearts. But this one was different. The Queen's mouth had been cut out. My fingers curled around the edge of the photo, my pulse hammering. Why? What the hell does this mean? Kieran's expression was unreadable. I don't know, but they left it for you, Magnus. Which means they want you to keep playing. The air in the room felt heavier. I pressed my hands against the desk, trying to steady my thoughts, trying to piece it together. Had this been about Celine at all? Or had I been the target the entire time? Kieran ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. Whoever they are, they don't just kill. They play games. And you? His eyes locked onto mine, voice steady but sharp. You're in the middle of one. Something deep in my chest tightened. I had spent the past 24 hours desperate to find my wife, convinced that she had fallen into the hands of something far worse than a simple affair. But now I wasn't sure if she was the real prize. Maybe she was just a move. Maybe I had been the goal all along. They don't just kill, they play games. And you? You're in the middle of one. Kieran's words stuck to my ribs like ice. For the past 24 hours, I had been drowning in uncertainty, believing Celine had stumbled into something she couldn't escape from. But now it felt like I was the one who had been lured in. Or worse, maybe I had been in this game from the start. My heartbeat pounded against my skull as I tried to make sense of it. You said they've been watching me for weeks. Why? What the hell do they want? Kieran leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried something close to caution. That's what I'm trying to figure out. My fingers curled into fists. If they wanted me dead, they would have done it already. If they wanted Celine, why involve me at all? None of this makes sense. Kieran didn't reply right away. Instead, he picked up one of the photos of me being followed, turning it over in his hands like the answer was hidden between the ink and paper. Then he finally said it. They're waiting for you to play. A cold chill ran down my spine. Play? Kieran met my gaze. They're not after money. They're not after revenge. This isn't a random abduction. They want something from you, Magnus. And the only way you're going to figure it out is if you follow the trail they're leaving. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. And if I don't? Kieran exhaled, tapping the edge of the desk. Then they'll make the next move for you. Neither of us spoke after that. The room felt smaller, heavier, like the air had thickened with something unseen. Then, Kieran's phone vibrated against the wooden surface, cutting through the silence like a gunshot. We both froze. His eyes flicked down to the screen. Then he turned it toward me. Unknown number. A cold pressure built in my chest. Neither of us moved as the phone buzzed again. Then, it stopped. A moment later, a text appeared. Took you long enough. Ready to play, Magnus? Something in me cracked. I grabbed the phone, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. How the hell do they have your number? Kieran didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the screen, his expression dark, his mind already running a dozen calculations. But I already knew the answer. They weren't just watching us. They were listening. Kieran took the phone back, his jaw clenched. They want a reaction. I forced myself to take a slow breath, but my pulse was racing, my thoughts spiraling. Well, they're getting one. Kieran's hand clamped onto my shoulder, firm, unshaking. That's exactly what they want, Vale. You lose control, you lose the game. I gritted my teeth, fighting the urge to throw the phone across the room. Kieran swiped across the screen, scrolling. Burner number, no traceable location. Of course. I raked a hand through my hair, the pressure in my skull tightening like a vice. Then what the hell do we do? Kieran was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me. We play. I hated it. Every cell in my body screamed that this was wrong, that we were walking straight into whatever trap they had laid. But waiting? Doing nothing? That was worse. So we played. Kieran set up a secure line, masking our location before sending a reply. What do you want? Seconds passed, then minutes. Nothing. I exhaled sharply, pacing the length of the room. Maybe they're screwing with us. Kieran didn't answer. Then, his phone vibrated again, but this time, it wasn't a text. It was an image. I felt the weight in my chest tighten as Kieran opened it. The photo was dark, grainy, but it was clear enough. A room, bare concrete walls, a single metal chair, and something on the floor. No, not something. Someone. A figure, bound at the wrists, head slumped forward, a blindfold covering their eyes. My breath stalled. Kieran zoomed in. The person's body was limp, motionless. Their clothes were disheveled, torn in places. I felt my stomach twist into knots. It wasn't Celine, but it was someone I recognized. Dorian Kael. My pulse pounded in my ears. The man who had taken my wife. The man who had walked out the door with her that night. The man I had spent the last day assuming was already dead. Now, he was here. Alive. For now. Kieran's phone buzzed again. A second message appeared beneath the image. Next move is yours, Magnus. Be careful. Wrong choices have consequences. The words felt like a noose tightening around my throat. I took a step back, my breathing sharp. Dorian wasn't a target. He was bait, and I was the one they were reeling in. I turned to Kieran, my voice lower, more controlled than I felt. Where the hell do we even start? Kieran studied the photo again, his expression unreadable. They gave us more than they meant to. He turned the phone toward the light, squinting at the background of the image. Look here, this corner. There's something written on the wall. I leaned in. Faint, just barely visible through the shadowed concrete, were 3 letters. E-I-C. I frowned. What does that mean? Kieran didn't move, his face unusually still. I don't know yet. His voice had changed, carefully controlled, almost like he did know. And that scared me more than anything. The letters on the wall stared back at me, faint but unmistakable. E-I-C. I didn't know what they meant, but Kieran did. I could see it in the way his body tensed, in the way his jaw locked as he stared at the image. Not with curiosity, with recognition. Something cold settled in my stomach. I turned to him, my voice low. You know what this is. Kieran didn't answer immediately. Instead, he inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose, his fingers tightening around the edges of the phone. Then, finally, it's not good, Vale. A pulse of frustration burned through my chest. Yeah, no shit. How about something useful? Kieran closed his eyes briefly, then ran a hand through his hair. I've seen those letters before. EIC isn't just random graffiti. It stands for something. A name. My stomach twisted. A company? His gaze flicked to me. A syndicate. The weight of the word hit like a punch to the ribs. I felt my pulse pick up, a slow, creeping dread wrapping around my ribs. What kind of syndicate? Kieran was silent for a moment too long. Then, he finally spoke. The kind that deals in people. The room shrank around me. My vision tunneled for half a second as my brain tried to process what he had just said. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. You're saying Celine... I couldn't finish the sentence. Kieran's voice was flat. I don't know. But if Dorian was involved with them, she was never just an affair. She was a target. I took a step back, my mind racing. For the past 24 hours, I had assumed Celine had chosen to leave, that she had walked into something dangerous out of recklessness, stupidity, selfishness. Whatever the reason, I had believed she had made the choice. But what if she hadn't? What if she had been taken? A slow, sharp anger crawled up my spine. Then we need to find Dorian. Now. Kieran exhaled sharply, nodding. He picked up his phone again, analyzing the image. There's something else. I moved closer as he zoomed in on the background. Beyond the letters, just barely visible through the shadows, was a rusted metal door. A pattern of stains on the concrete floor. And something else. Something small. A drain. Kieran's voice was grim. This isn't just a holding room. It's a kill room. A shiver crawled down my spine. They hadn't just taken Dorian to keep him alive. They had taken him to make an example of him. And if we didn't get to him first, we'd be walking into the aftermath. 2 hours later, we were on the road. Kieran drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel, his focus sharp and unwavering. I stared out the window, watching the city dissolve into the darkness. The neon lights, the streets filled with people who had no idea that just outside their bubble of normalcy, there were monsters hunting in the shadows. Celine had walked out that door, and now I was chasing ghosts in the dark, following a trail I didn't understand, searching for a man I wanted to kill just as much as I wanted to save. Dorian Kyle. I had spent the last day assuming he was dead, that he had disappeared into whatever abyss had swallowed Celine. But he was alive, for now. And that meant something. It meant this wasn't over yet. The thought sent another wave of unease through me. I turned to Kieran. You said you've seen EIC before. What did you mean? His jaw tightened. It was years ago. A case I worked in New Orleans, missing girl. Cops weren't getting anywhere, so the family hired me. I frowned. Did you find her? Kieran's grip on the wheel tightened. Not all of her. I swallowed, nausea twisting in my stomach. Kieran exhaled, his voice quieter. She had been marked, cut, left in pieces, but they made sure we knew who did it. A Queen of Hearts was carved into her skin. A slow, sickening dread spread through my chest. The playing cards. They weren't just a signature. They were a brand. A warning. I turned back to the window, watching the city lights disappear in the distance. You still think this is just about Celine? Kieran was silent, because we both knew the answer. Somewhere, deep in my gut, I was starting to think this had never been about her at all. We reached the industrial district just past 3 a.m. It was deserted. Rows of warehouses stretched out ahead of us like metal tombstones, their facades rusted and weather-worn under flickering streetlights. Kieran pulled the car into a shadowed alley, killing the headlights. A dense, suffocating silence settled over the area. Something about the emptiness felt wrong. I scanned the buildings ahead, my pulse picking up. You sure? Kieran pulled out his phone, comparing the image from the text to the structure in front of us. The rusted door, the drain outside, it matched. This was the place. A low electric tension settled in my chest. And what if this is a trap? Kieran's smirk was humorless. It's definitely a trap. The only question is who it's meant for. I exhaled slowly, gripping the handle of the gun he had given me before we left. My fingers felt steady, but my blood was thrumming with something sharp, something volatile. I wasn't just stepping into some abandoned warehouse. I was stepping into a game I didn't understand, playing by rules I hadn't been told. I turned to Kieran. Let's go find out. The air inside the warehouse was suffocating, thick with dust, with oil, with blood. The moment Kieran and I stepped through the rusted entrance, I knew. We weren't alone. The space was massive, a sprawling industrial graveyard of rusted machinery and forgotten debris. The overhead light flickered erratically, barely illuminating the long rows of metal shelves. In the farthest corners, the shadows ran deep. Too deep. Kieran moved first, his gun raised, his body tense. A predator entering enemy territory. I followed, my own weapon steady in my grip, every muscle in my body wired tight. The only sounds were the faint hum of electricity and a slow, rhythmic drip. I swallowed hard, the metallic scent thick in my lungs. Then, Kieran froze. He held up a fist, a silent signal to stop. I obeyed. He tilted his head, listening. Then, in a voice so low I barely caught it. "We're being watched." My fingers tightened around my gun. "Where?" Kieran didn't answer, because he didn't know. But whoever they were, they knew exactly where we were. Then, a sound. Metal scraping against concrete. We both turned toward the far end of the warehouse. A single rusted door stood slightly ajar, a dim yellow light spilling from within. And beyond that, a shadow moved. Kieran's body tensed. He motioned for me to follow. We approached slowly, step by step, the silence stretched tight between us like a wire about to snap. Then, a voice. Low, hoarse, weak, but familiar. About time. Dorian. He was slumped in a chair, his head hanging low, his wrists bound behind his back. His shirt was torn, his face swollen and bruised. Dried blood clung to the corner of his mouth. But he was breathing. He was alive, for now. Kieran reached him first, checking his pulse. I kept my gun raised, scanning the shadows, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the trap to spring. But nothing happened. No movement, no sound. That was wrong. This was too easy. I turned back to Dorian. His eyelids flickered, his lips parted slightly. Like he was struggling to speak. I stepped closer. "Dorian, who did this? Where's Celine?" His body jerked slightly, his fingers twitched. Then, his eyes snapped open, wild, desperate, and his first word wasn't a name, wasn't an answer. It was a warning. "Run!" Bang! The gunshot ripped through the silence like a blade. I barely had time to react before Kieran tackled me. Another shot rang out, shattering one of the overhead lights. The warehouse plunged into flickering darkness. I hit the ground hard, Kieran rolling off me just as another round whizzed past my head. I still couldn't see them, but I could hear them now. Footsteps. Multiple. Fast. Closing in. Shit. I scrambled to my feet, barely catching sight of Dorian slumping forward in his chair, either unconscious or worse. We needed to move. Now. Kieran fired 2 quick shots into the darkness, then grabbed my arm, pulling me behind a stack of crates. They were waiting for us. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the edge of something else beneath it. Rage. Or worse, fear. I pressed my back against the crates, my breath uneven. How many? More than us. Great. The gunfire had stopped, but the footsteps hadn't. They weren't in a rush, because they knew we were trapped. I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening on my gun. I wasn't going to die here. I wasn't going to let them win. I turned to Kieran. We get to Dorian. We get out. Kieran's jaw clenched. We get out. Yeah. But Dorian. His eyes flicked toward the man slumped in the chair, then toward the approaching footsteps. He's already dead. The warehouse was a labyrinth of rusted beams, towering shelves and decaying machinery. It could work for us, or against us. Right now, it was both. I peered around the crates, catching a glimpse of movement, a silhouette slipping between the shadows. They were positioning, boxing us in. I turned back to Kieran. "We don't have much time." He nodded, scanning the space. "We need an exit." I searched the warehouse. The main entrance was suicide. The windows were too high. Then I saw it. A side door. Steel. Reinforced. But slightly ajar. A possible way out, if we could reach it. Kieran followed my gaze and nodded. Then he pulled something from his jacket. A small metal cylinder. I frowned. "Is that flashbang?" Of course he had one. Kieran pulled the pin, held it for half a second, then tossed it across the warehouse. Boom! A blinding white light filled the space, followed by a concussive blast that rattled my bones. Shouts erupted from the shadows. Gunfire. But it was wild, panicked. This was our chance. Kieran grabbed Dorian, throwing one of the man's arms over his shoulder. "Move! Veil!" I didn't hesitate. We sprinted for the exit. More gunfire, closer this time. I heard bullets tearing through crates, ricocheting off steel. The side door loomed ahead. 20 feet. 15. 10. Then, a shadow stepped into our path. A figure dressed in black, raising a gun. Bang! I fired first. The figure jerked back, crumpling to the ground. I didn't stop running. I slammed into the door, shoving it open with my shoulder. And we were out. Out into the freezing night, the air burning in my lungs, the street eerily silent compared to the chaos behind us. Kieran dragged Dorian toward the car. I took one last glance over my shoulder. The warehouse was dark, silent, but not empty. They were still in there, watching, waiting. And I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The car sliced through the night, headlights cutting through the empty streets like knives. Kieran drove like a man possessed, his grip on the wheel so tight, I thought it might snap. He hadn't spoken since we left the warehouse, but he didn't need to. We had escaped, but not cleanly. I sat in the back seat, pressing down hard on Dorian's shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding. His body was limp against the seat, his breath ragged and uneven. He was barely clinging to consciousness. And that's what scared me the most. If the people who took him had wanted him dead, they wouldn't have let him live this long. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Dorian, can you hear me?" No response. I swallowed, adjusting my grip, and tried again. "Dorian, wake up." Nothing. Then, just as I was about to shake him, his lips moved. A whisper, too soft to hear. I leaned in closer. "Say that again." His mouth barely formed the words, but I heard them. "You shouldn't have come." A sharp chill ran down my spine. I pulled back slightly. What does that mean? Dorian's body tensed, his fingers twitching against the seat. His breathing picked up, chest rising and falling in uneven, shallow bursts. Then, his head started shaking, over and over. "No, no, no!" His voice was hoarse, cracked with something close to terror. His movements became jerky, his arms trembling violently beneath my grip. Then, suddenly, he started thrashing. "Hey, hey!" I grabbed his arms, trying to pin him down. "Dorian, calm down!" But he wasn't hearing me. His eyes darted wildly, unfocused, his lips moving without sound. He wasn't trying to fight us. He was trying to get away. From something else. Kieran glanced at us in the rearview mirror, his expression hardening. Shit, he's going into shock. I barely had time to react before Dorian screamed. A raw, broken sound that sent every nerve in my body alight. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. His entire body went limp. His head rolled to the side. And that's when I saw it. The blood pooling beneath his shirt. A sick, twisting sensation coiled in my gut. I yanked back the torn fabric. and froze. His skin had been carved. Deep, jagged cuts stretched across his ribs, fresh and still bleeding. And in the center of it all, a queen of hearts, carved into his flesh. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. They hadn't just tortured him. They had marked him, like cattle, like property. My grip tightened, nails digging into my palms. What kind of game was this? The safe house was cold when we arrived. Kieran barely had the car in park before I was hauling Dorian inside, my pulse still hammering from what I had just seen. The place was small, barely furnished. A worn-out couch, a wooden table covered in old files, a single lamp casting a dim glow against the peeling wallpaper. It felt wrong, like we had brought something back with us, something that didn't belong. I lowered Dorian onto the couch, watching as his chest rose and fell in uneven gasps. Then I turned to Kieran. What the hell does this mean? Kieran didn't respond right away. He just stared down at Dorian's wound, his face carefully blank. Too blank. Finally, he exhaled. They knew we'd find him. I clenched my jaw. Yeah, no shit. But why carve that into him? Kieran's silence stretched. Because we already knew. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a warning. It was a signature. A claim. A way of saying he was never ours to take. A slow, sinking weight settled in my chest. I turned back to Dorian. His fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered. Then, he started whispering. At first, I couldn't make it out. Then, "It's a game." The words barely escaped his lips, strained and weak, but I heard them. I swallowed. What game, Dorian? His eyes cracked open, glassy with pain. His lips trembled. Then, he laughed. A weak, broken sound, but not one of relief, one of despair. My pulse quickened. Dorian, what are you talking about? He exhaled shakily, his breath hitching. It was never about Celine. The room went still. The air left my lungs. I took a slow step back. Then what was it about? Dorian's gaze lifted, and for the first time I saw it. The truth, the understanding, the horror. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "It was always about you." The words settled over me like ice. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Because deep down, I already knew. Then the phone rang. The sharp, sudden sound made my pulse spike. Not mine, not Kieran's, Dorian's. Kieran and I exchanged a look. Then, slowly, I reached into Dorian's pocket, pulling out the phone. The screen was cracked. The caller ID read, "Unknown." A slow dread unfurled in my chest. Kieran's voice was low. "Don't answer it." But my thumb was already pressing accept. I lifted the phone to my ear. I didn't speak. Neither did they. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, a voice. Smooth. Amused. And chilling. "You should have left him there, Magnus." My blood ran cold. My grip tightened on the phone. "Who the hell is this?" The voice chuckled softly, like it was genuinely amused. "You'll find out soon enough." Then, the line went dead. The screen flickered. A new message appeared. One that made my breath stall. A single image. Not of Celine, not of Dorian, not of me, but of Kieran. A photo of him, taken from behind, standing right outside the safe house, taken just seconds ago. I looked up, the window, the street outside, the headlights. My stomach dropped. I turned to Kieran. We're not alone. The street outside was empty, too empty. The kind of empty that didn't happen by accident. The kind that was made. A slow, suffocating dread curled in my chest as I turned the phone toward Kieran. His expression barely changed, just the slightest narrowing of his eyes, the smallest shift in his stance. But I could feel it. He knew what this meant. We had never been safe. Not in the warehouse, not in the car, not here. I moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows, and scanned the street again. No movement, no figures lurking in the darkness. But the headlights from a car parked across the road burned like eyes in the night. Watching, waiting. I exhaled slowly. They're here. Kieran's jaw tightened. They've been here. His voice was steady, but something sharp lingered beneath it. Something I hadn't heard before. Something close to fear. Dorian let out a low, ragged breath from the couch. His body was limp, but his fingers twitched against the stained fabric. His lips parted, barely forming words. It's too late. I turned to him. Dorian, what does that mean? His eyelids fluttered. He sucked in a shuddering breath. Then, he laughed, soft, weak. But there was something wrong about it, something broken. They're already inside. The light flickered. Then, the front door burst open. A figure moved fast, too fast, a shadow slicing through the dim light, lunging for Kieran. Bang! Kieran fired. The shot ripped through the room, but the attacker barely slowed. Body armor. I reached for my gun just as another figure slammed into me, tackling me backward. We hit the floor hard, my head cracking against the wooden boards. Stars exploded in my vision, my grip on the gun loosening for half a second. Just enough time for the attacker to rip it from my hand. I reacted on instinct. I drove my knee up into their ribs, twisting my body at the same time, throwing my weight against them. We rolled across the floor, struggling for control. A flash of metal, a knife. I caught the attacker's wrist just before the blade could sink into my throat. They were strong, but I was angry. I twisted the knife out of their grip and slammed my elbow into their face, hard enough to feel the crunch of bone. The attacker fell back with a sharp grunt, and I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gun off the floor and fired twice. They dropped. Breathing hard, I pushed myself up, just in time to see Kieran take down the second one. The room wasn't silent. Dorian was gasping on the couch. The floorboards creaked beneath shifting weight. The echoes of the gunshots still rang in my ears, but for a moment no one moved. Then, a slow clap, coming from the doorway. I turned, and there he was, a man in a tailored black suit standing just beyond the threshold. He looked ordinary, neat, polished, a businessman. Not a killer, but I knew. This was him, the one who had been pulling the strings all along. He smiled. Well done, Magnus. My grip on the gun tightened. Kieran took a step forward. Who the hell are you? The man ignored him. His eyes, cold, calculating, stayed locked on mine. You should have played your part. I exhaled sharply, steadying my aim. Yeah? And what part was that? His smile didn't waver. The one where you lost. A sharp click echoed through the room. Then, pain, white-hot and sudden, tearing through my ribs. I staggered back, vision swimming, my breath catching in my throat. The gun slipped from my fingers. I barely heard Kieran shout, barely registered the third figure stepping out of the shadows behind me, the one who had just stabbed me. I hit the floor, cold. The pain was deep, a burning, twisting agony radiating through my chest. I pressed a hand to the wound, feeling the warm, sticky wetness spread beneath my fingertips. I tried to push myself up, but my limbs weren't listening. Kieran moved, fast, raising his gun, but the suited man just sighed. No need for that. Kieran froze, not because of his words, but because of the gun now pressed to Dorian's head. Another attacker, silent, efficient, had slipped in unnoticed. Dorian barely reacted. like he had been expecting it. The man in the suit tilted his head. "Let's not be reckless now, shall we?" Kieran's jaw clenched. His gun wavered. I tried to speak, to tell him not to drop it, but I couldn't. The blood loss was hitting fast, turning the edges of my vision black. I wasn't going to make it. The suited man knew it. He crouched beside me, his smile almost amused. "You weren't supposed to be here, Magnus." My pulse pounded in my ears. "Then, why am I?" His smile widened. "Because you made the mistake of caring." Darkness pressed in. I fought it. I lost. I woke up to the sound of rain, soft, steady. A dull ache spread through my chest, every breath sharp and shallow. I was alive. Barely. The safe house was gone. The room I was in now was different. A hospital, dimly lit, monitors beeping softly. I blinked, trying to sit up. Pain flared instantly, pulling a sharp curse from my lips. Movement to my right. Then, a voice. "You're lucky." I turned my head. Kieran. He looked like hell. Bruised. Bandaged. But alive. I swallowed hard. "Dorian?" Kieran's face darkened. Then, after a pause, he shook his head. "Gone." I didn't ask how. Didn't ask if he had been taken, or if Kieran had been forced to leave him behind. I already knew the answer. A slow, sick weight settled in my chest. Kieran ran a hand down his face, exhaling. "They let us live." I frowned. "Why?" He hesitated. Then, he slid something across the table, a playing card, the King of Hearts. The edges were stained with blood. Not mine, not Kieran's, Dorian's. Kieran met my eyes, and for the first time since this started, I saw fear. Because this isn't over, Vale. It's only just begun.